Hello, my name is Don Perlgut. I'm the CEO of Community Colleges Australia. My presentation today is on inequality in Australia. What can vocational education and training do to address it? I've got a number of different things that I'll be covering in the presentation, starting with a dedication and purpose. Following that, a review of wealth inequality in the USA and Australia. Number 3, the billionaire's present moment. Well, 3A, does inequality of wealth matter? Australians believe that education matters. The vet fee help inequality fail through poor policy settings. Indigenous participation in vet, post-secondary education and employment outcomes comparison. A return on investment in vet, regional and rural vet. Australian adult and community education, known as ACE. Youth unemployment. And finally, conclusions. 6 different ways to enable vet to achieve its capacity to make Australia a more equal and just society. First of all, my dedication. We all do better when we all do better, was said by Senator Paul Wellstone in a speech to unions back in September 1999. I knew Senator Wellstone. He was my teacher when I studied briefly in a summer at the University of California, Berkeley. He was older than I, and he was very young at the time. The picture on the right-hand side of the screen is the way he looked. The picture on the left is when he was a senator. He died tragically in a plane crash in the snowy wastes of Minnesota in the height of his career. But it was he who turned me on to inequality of wealth and the importance of doing better. I dedicate this presentation and this topic to the memory and the leadership and guidance of the late Senator Paul Wellstone. The purpose of the presentation is fourfold. Number 1, I want to reinforce the importance of tackling Australian inequality through education and training. Number 2, Australia's vet system needs more resources and reform. We're too focused on private profit and not enough on social and economic outcomes. Number 3, Australian vet is one of our greatest equalizers, and we need to continue to make it so. And number 4, the Australian not-for-profit adult and community education sector, known as ACE, is an underutilized resource. We are experiencing, and have been for some time, what I call an economic moment, a growing concern for inequality in our sector. And in many ways, the COVID-19 period and era that we have been in for almost 2 years now has made it worse. We've seen this in books such as Capital by Thomas Piketty and a number of other areas, Joseph Stiglitz's work, Price of Inequality and other works, or The Spirit Level by Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett. In 2017, some 5 years ago, we saw this come home to roost here in Sydney, where we had homelessness protests outside of the Reserve Bank of Australia on Martin Place. If you hadn't seen it at the time, I captured the images then. They were moved on after a few weeks, but it was a good indication that we do have significant inequality in Australia. And unfortunately, in many ways, it has gotten worse, although we had a brief blip of improved equality during the very beginning of the pandemic when various government funding sources made substantial increases. Let's call it the top 1% versus the rest. The concern about inequality is not just on what we'd call the left or the progressive side of politics, but also on the right or the conservative side of politics, as indicated by this quote by Senator Ted Cruz, who said today the top 1% earn a higher share of national income than any year since 1928. That's Senator Ted Cruz, conservative senator, said back in January 2015, citing Professor Manuel Saez from the University of California at Berkeley. Distribution of wealth in our society is unequal, and we have a number of indications just in the last couple of months which have shown that. This indication from the New York Times, billionaires world, Elon Musk. Well, the word on the Elon Musk was the world's richest person. He didn't like Twitter, so he bought it. Look at the share of inequality of wealth in the United States. We'll get to Australia in a few minutes. Owned by the top 0.1% of households. That's 1/100th of 1/100th. some 10.8 or almost 11% as of the end of 2021. It's pretty significant data here. Wealth continues to grow, and in fact, looking at those numbers, that the inequality has actually become as bad or in fact worse than it was any time within living memory, going back to 1929, before what was known as the Great Depression. We're immune in Australia, aren't we? Well, not quite. Look what happened in our most recent Australian 22 federal election. One Australian who has a great deal of wealth created a party that was his party, and he put in a massive amount of money, bought a numerous amount of ads, spent what is estimated to be $40 million or up to $100 million on that. Extraordinary amounts of money. The result of that being one senator out of the whole of the federal parliament. Nevertheless, one of the points of all this is that large amounts of money can make democracies unequal. We can look to the United States of America to see how that operates in practice. Well, what about Australia? We're in the mid-rank of inequality. The Genie coefficient, as it is known, is a number of basically trying to show inequality. If you look at Genie coefficient for Australia, this goes back to the mid-2010s, but it's pretty similar now. Emerging countries have a much higher level. That's the top level on this slide, have a much higher level of inequality. The United States of America, quite significant, one of the very worst, certainly of the developed countries. The United Kingdom, worse than Australia. We're getting up there, but we're not as bad as the US and the UK. Nevertheless, generally, we sit above the average of developed countries, and certainly above, significantly above, our most common comparison country, which would be Canada. We have our own challenges here in Australia when it comes to inequality of wealth. What about wealth in Australia? We can look at it in a number of different ways. The poorest 40% of Australian households have effectively no wealth at all, where in many cases, their debts actually more or less equal their assets. Many people, as I said, may have net debt because of their debts. The wealthiest 10% of households, nevertheless, have more than half the wealth, maybe not as bad as the USA, but pretty significant. Look at the highest quintile in the upper right-hand corner of the screen, with some 20% of the population, but certainly some 60% of the wealth. But the top 1% of households here in Australia have at least 15% of wealth. This shows a relatively unbalanced distribution. The top 10%, and especially the top 1% in our country, is getting cumulatively richer. And that has continued over the course of the COVID-19 pandemic. We have two fault lines that have been widening between the bottom 40% and the rest, that's the 40 and 60, and between the top 10% and the following 50% in the middle. Wealth is unequally distributed in Australia, also by city, by suburb, and by region. We can look at this. This is a schematic map of Sydney showing the socioeconomic areas known as CEFA, coming from the Australian Bureau of Statistics. The blue are some of the more advantaged areas. The dark blue, the most advantaged. The red, the pink are some of the, and orange are some of the least advantaged areas. What it shows you is not surprising. The blue areas, particularly around the harbour, in the lower North Shore, the eastern suburbs of Sydney, the northern beaches of Sydney are some of the most advantaged, and some of our least advantaged are in western and especially southwestern Sydney. And you can also see some significant places of disadvantaged up in the Central Coast area. So what does inequality of wealth actually matter? Well, we have increasing in economic inequality because it inhibits economic growth. Put quite simply, when people have money and when they're poor, they tend to spend it. When rich people get additional money, they tend to save it or to put it on luxury goods that don't necessarily assist the country. Economic inequality also helps to destroy social cohesion, and we've seen this in a number of different places. It can undermine democracy, and it can exacerbate social problems, including COVID-19 management and other health problems. We've seen that in Australia, where the bottom 20% of Australians have had death rates at least 3 and 4 times the top income earners in Australia when it comes to COVID-19. That is due purely and simply because of wealth and income. And economic inequality also offends the idea of a just society because it upends the belief that we have in Australia that we are the land of the fair go. So what do Australian economists think? Well, a few years ago, the Economic Society of Australia surveyed them about what would it mean. And they concluded that Australia will have a bigger economic growth dividend in the long run by spending on education than offering an equivalent amount of money on a tax cut to business. 60% of economists either agreed or strongly agreed with that statement. Now we have to note, economists are notoriously not flaming left-wing progressives, but nevertheless, they strongly believe that economic growth will be much better by investing in education rather than giving business tax cuts. Let's turn to vocational education and training, of course, and VET. I want to show one interesting case study about what I call the VET fee help case study, which is a VET policy fail. And it just shows, for instance, that VET is not necessarily an untrammeled and possible amazing and extraordinary public good. Public borrowing for the VET fee help program increased from 26 million in 2009 to up to more than almost 3 billion in 2015. But yet this became a major VET inequality public policy fail, said by some to have become some of the worst public policy failures in our history. Why and what happened? Well, a large proportion of VET fee help loans or VFH loans are never going to be repaid. A large proportion of the loans went to courses that had no links to industry needs or to students' employment outcomes. But more than anything, why did this happen? The scheme, it dulled price signals. There were no upfront costs, led to the perception that courses were absolutely free. And many unscrupulous providers promoted the courses as free. And as a result, the course of VET fee help courses ended up, the cost bore little relationship to the true efficient course of delivery. And you can see this. The average tuition fee of a full-time VET fee help student in salon management was almost 33,000. But the New South Wales Smart and Skilled qualification price at the time was 6,300. About 20% of it. And that was consistent with many others, including the Diploma of Project Management, Diploma of Marketing, Diploma of Events, and the Diploma of Accounting. These are some of the concerns that we have to ensure that when we're establishing VET programs, we have appropriately guardrails and policy considerations. It is not necessarily a force for inequality if the policy settings are wrong. Also under VET fee help, Indigenous and disadvantaged people, low socioeconomic status students accrued higher fees and debts compared to non-Indigenous and non-disadvantaged students, as we can see. The mean tuition fee for Indigenous students was almost $20,000. Non-Indigenous, just over $14,000. For the lowest income people, $16,000. For the highest income people, just under $13,000. This is a strong indication that VET, if it is done badly and delivered badly and priced badly, is not necessarily the best thing for disadvantaged people. And in fact, it can operate in the opposite direction. VET is important, as this table shows, because it outperforms universities. In the left-hand column, we have the university enrollment percentages through various vulnerable and disadvantaged groups, low SES, meaning the bottom 25%. Then the VET middle column, the VET students. This is total VET. And this was in the period roughly 2019, I think, and the community education students. In every single case, total VET student program enrollments outperformed universities when it came to engagement of disadvantaged and vulnerable groups. That is really profound. And look at how significant some of those are. Low SES, students with disability. But the community, the not-for-profit community vet sector, outperformed even total vet in every case except for remote and very remote students. These are very deep and profound indications where things like people with a disability, some 16% of the community education students have a disability or had a disability that year. As compared to 8% of vet students or only total vet, or only 7.3% of university students. These are important things and ideas to remember. We need to value education as an investment and not just as a commodity, because why is Australian vet sector a market and not the higher education or school sectors? Almost 72% of vet students enrolled in a private for-profit provider, 20% in TAFE, almost just under 10% in adult and community education or ACE, 2% in universities, maybe 3% in schools, and 5% of higher education students are in higher for-profit institutions. Why do we have such a large number of vet students in for-profit? It is because of the privatization of the vet sector, which I view is one of those things which holds vet back from being a significant positive force in society. Education does matter in Australia, and we look at some of the comparisons in terms of unemployment rates. This is 2016, obviously well before our current moment. Having a bachelor's degree or a diploma certainly meant very low unemployment, even a certificate 3 and 4, but with just a year 12 or year 11 or year 10 or below, your chance of being unemployed was much, much higher. That is also the forgotten middle child of education. This is not my concept, but this is a concept that was brought through the Community of Economic Development of Australia and the work and concept by Dr. Damien Oliver, formerly UTS, and now with the National Skills Commission. Like a forgotten middle child, it is squeezed between schools with a lot of policy attention, and the universities, you get prestige and status like the oldest child. And look at vet. And at the bottom line on the graph on your screen is the real value of full-time student education indexed to 1999. That's vet at the very bottom compared to primary schools, secondary schools, and higher education. Indigenous participation is important. We can see this. By and large, Indigenous Australians participate in vet at approximately double the rate of non-Indigenous Australians, but in higher education at approximately half the rate of non-Indigenous Australians. This again shows that when it comes to education, that has a very profound impact. That is also crucial, as in university employment, apprenticeship, traineeship graduates, vet graduates often perform better than people with a bachelor's degree when it comes to employment outcomes. Similarly, vet graduates employed within 6 months of completing also perform better, especially diploma and certificate 4 and 3, much less so at certificate 1 and 2, what is often known, of course, as foundational skills. That therefore means that we need to be ensuring that people go beyond certificates 1 and 2 to certificates 3 and above. There's also substantial return on vet to Australian society, which I won't review in great detail here, but wanted to make certain that you were aware of. This is based on very valuable NCVER research that was published in July of 2016 in terms of investment to Australian society and investment to Australian businesses. I encourage you to go find that research and to look at that value. That is also important to regional and rural Australia. That's crucial to the Australian because of the economic structures. Participation rates in vet are at least 50% higher in rural and regional New South Wales, for instance, where it might be 6% or so in metro, about 12% in e-regional, about 15% in outer regional, 15% in remote, and 19% in very remote. And a larger percentage of the regional and rural vet students also study at lower level qualifications, frequently especially at their certificate 3. And it is very important, of course, for the adult and community education or ACE sector. Now, I want to talk a bit about the ACE sector because I believe very strongly, not just because I represent the ACE sector, but also because I think it is true. The ACE sector has a very, very important role in vet. The history is very important. It goes back to 1833, or directly back to 1913 with the establishments of the WEAs, or the Worker Education Associations. The branding is often confused with TAFE and private providers. Perception is often for non-accredited, but increasingly over the last 20 plus years, it has been registered accredited VET. There are more than 400 ACE training providers in Australia, mostly in Victoria and New South Wales, and there's a couple of thousand of our ACE providers delivering pre-accredited, pre-vocational, and other interest training. Some of the 4 million or so VET students in 2020, about 10% studied with a not-for-profit ACE provider. This was a substantial decrease from the previous year due to the impact of COVID-19, the unequal impact of COVID-19 on ACE students, many of whom were vulnerable, disadvantaged, and withdrew from accredited training, especially Indigenous Australians and people with a disability. And many of them have not yet returned. But yet the ACE sector still has the best performance of any VET sector in lifting unemployed people into employment, with some 12%, for instance, in New South Wales, of community education graduates moving from unemployment to employment in 2020. And finally, VET has a really crucial role in aged care workforce training, with 23% of Certificate 3 individual support students in the aging, government funded in New South Wales, graduates coming out of the ACE sector, 19% in Victoria, and some 13% nationally. So why are ACE providers so important to VET equality? Well, partly because the community support is because of the not-for-profit status and the mission to do good. For instance, the Verto mission is to positively transform the lives of individuals, families, and communities. It's also because the ACE sector is place-based and builds on local and regional strengths to create pathways to jobs. It's the ability of that sector to develop and sustain partnerships with government and nonprofit organizations, because the sector is also learner-centered with smaller class sizes, and because it can collaborate. ACE providers can collaborate with each other and therefore leverage collective strengths. They're flexible, they're agile, not bound by government structures like TAFE, not beholden to shareholders to make a profit, and they invest in their local communities. ACE providers also reach vulnerable disadvantaged students at very high numbers. On almost all track members, they do very well. I encourage you to look at the CCA work that we've done on this. Youth unemployment is one of our ongoing challenges, and I highlight it here because I think that VET has a very important role, but we cannot just believe that we're going to build courses and they will show. Even in times of relatively low unemployment, and we are in that time, the idea that somehow youth are all doing fine is simply not true. They are vulnerable and they need assistance, and we need to ensure that we have the outreach activities in engagement in vocational education and training. Finally, I want to conclude on what I call the 6 ways to enable VET to achieve its capacity to make Australia a more equal and a more just society. Because I think we need to get serious about enabling VET to make Australia more equal and just. Number 1, by creating proper pathways from ACE to TAFE, and I don't see enough of those, and from VET to the universities. It is really important. We don't do enough, and there are very few things holding us back other than institutional inertia. Number 2, we need to develop regional skills plans, both in metropolitan and non-metropolitan areas, which prioritize social justice goals and consider the needs of disadvantaged learners. 3, we need to fund foundation skills, language literacy, numeracy, digitally, and employability skills. We need to fund them properly. We need to recognize the importance of foundation skills trainers and the special needs of adult basic education students who may not fit into traditional VET teaching models. And this includes working with organizations like the Reading Writing Hotline to recruit them. We have to ensure that VET is properly funded. We had 5.1% inflation to the 31st of March. Chances are VET funding is going to head backwards over the next 12 months on a percentage basis and a proper CPI basis. I can see that already from what I can see, anticipated in the state VET funding in 22-23. We also need to ensure that we have proper facilities and digital connectivity for ACE, adult community education. Fifth, I strongly propose a national outreach program to re-engage the disadvantaged and vulnerable vet learners who have left training because of COVID-19 concerns. That we have an ideal model in Australia, the Victorian Reconnect program, and the previous TAFE New South Wales outreach program. We have to include in that a focus on student support and mentoring. And finally, we need to renew national state policy statement on the value and the place of community education and its place in Australian skills and training, to update the 2008 ministerial statement, of which there's very little that means that is a problem right now. All of it is very applicable. These are things we need to do to ensure that VET can take its rightful and just place in creating a more equal society. My name is Don Perlgut. This has been my session, the NCVER conference in July 2022. Please contact me. If you have any questions, I would love to hear from you. Thank you.